Coming up on Point Spread Weekly, powered by the Vegas Stats and Information Network. We want to make you a better handicapper, and we've got plenty of sports wagering information. Join VSiN's betting experts and odds makers as they discuss sides, totals, money lines, props, and parlays, so you take sharper action. Cashing tickets is what it's all about. It's Point Spread Weekly, powered by VSiN, and it starts right now.
Welcome into another edition of Point Spread Weekly. I'm your host, Jonathan Von Tobel. Another fantastic edition on tap, as we usually do, because this week's Point Spread Weekly, like every single Point Spread Weekly, is absolutely loaded with content. And a quick reminder, if you want in on it, vsin.com/subscribe. These plus subs are free until a major sport returns. This week, jam-packed, not only just the sports that are currently active, like the KBO, like NASCAR. We have, of course, I can't wait to talk to Matt Youmans later in the show about it, the point value of quarterbacks. And the biggest myth when it comes to quarterbacks, right, in the NFL, the quarterbacks themselves are not worth point values. It's the differential between them and the quarterback behind them, but we'll get into that with Matt Youmans later in the program. Our continued coverage of the hot or not with Ron Flatter in terms of the run for the roses, if we have dubbed it here on Point Spread Weekly, and a little bit on the UFC Fight Night card coming up this weekend with Lou Finocchairo. Steve Makinen is with us, though, the editor of Point Spread Weekly, the mastermind behind it. Steve, before we get to all the content that you put in this week, you know, to take us through a little bit of this week's edition, because, again, like, this has been very fascinating. It's got a lot of fun stuff in it, but at the same time, there's so much information for handicappers to use, not only with the sports that are active now, but getting ready for the sports that are coming. I'm impressed every single week with what's been going on and what Point Spread Weekly has done.
Yeah, me too, Jonathan. And to be honest, I think you just did a great job of explaining a lot of what is in there already. And I'd like to mention more about that piece with the quarterbacks and the point values. That's going to be fantastic reference material for down the road. I mean, you want to keep that because that stuff doesn't really change until that backup quarterback gets some sort of playing time where they can adjust those numbers. Or it can go maybe the other way where the starting quarterback has some playing where he's maybe having a down season, that kind of thing. But until an injury happens, you don't really see how those things change. So it's good reference material to hang on to. A lot of great stuff, though, like you said, in Point Spread Weekly. I, like you, continue to be impressed by I like the way we've diversified, I guess, while this is going on, and expanded the content offerings and the number of writers that are contributing. So it's as much as this has been tough to deal with, it's been kind of a growing period for this publication.
Yeah, and we should know, too, right? So the numbers that we have here, Chris Andrews is nice enough every single year since we have started the Vegas Stats and Information Network to give us what he thinks in terms of the backup quarterbacks, the differentials there. But you're absolutely right. Like, to me, it reminds me of the power rating segments that we've had and, like, the issues that we've had. You know, that's something for you to keep, and you can also, like, you don't have to take it as a Bible, Steve, right? You can use that. You can make your own numbers, what you think some of these quarterbacks are worth going to their backups, and you can use it as a springboard for your own numbers and for your own information. So it's not like you have to take it and say, okay, this is what I'm looking for from here on out. You can take it, do some research, and then make your own in terms of if you think like one of the examples, Ryan Fitzpatrick and Tua Tagovailoa, a 2-point difference. But if you think it's a little bit more, at least you have a baseline to go off of. And that's what I think is impressive about this kind of stuff is you can use it to then create your own form of what you're getting here.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to maybe create a scenario where something like this might be useful, say we're watching week 1 NFL action, right, and unfortunately injuries do happen. They're going to happen. Everybody knows they're going to happen. As you're starting to prepare for the week 2 numbers, which are released obviously early Sunday evenings, be ready to hit that number if you could tell the backup quarterback is coming in, because you got this power rating adjustment that you can apply to your own ratings to see if you maybe find some value, maybe a little bit of a miss by the odds makers.
Right. And by the way, too, if you're watching, again, using that example, books like the Westgate, the Superbook, put out the, as they call it, the 12-day line. So you actually have numbers to go off of the coming up week. And then if there is an injury, you can look at the numbers, see if there's been an adjustment that you think is necessary, and you can move forward from there. So again, I think with Point Spread Weekly, Steve, with the Vegas Stats and Information Network in general, the task is to give you the information so that you can use it going forward, and you can actually just diversify your arsenal and how you attack handicapping. And I think every single week with Point Spread Weekly, like I said, we have the top 20 gambling movies in there. That's a fun piece, but there's so much more information that you can use just to better yourself as a handicapper. And again, it's everywhere in Point Spread Weekly. So check it out. It is vsin.com/subscribe. Remember, all of these plus subs are free until a major sport returns. It is chock full of information. We only get to talk to 4 writers every single week, but it is loaded with a lot more content. So let's take a look at it today. Again, vsin.com/subscribe. subscribe. With that, it is Point Spread Weekly here on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. Steve Makinen with us. All right, Steve, let's dive into some of the stuff that you had this week. Again, jam-packed. Did you get any break whatsoever? I think you had like 17 articles this week like you did last week.
No, only a few, but then a couple simulations. But hey, there's great momentum starting to come up here. NHL announcement of the playoffs, the NBA's talking. Unfortunately, baseball, we got nothing, but there's some stuff going on, and hey, some chance to cash some tickets. So time to get back at it.
Yeah. Well, actually, you know, let's since you talked about that, that's the natural jumping off point. So on page 22 of this week's edition of Point Spread Weekly, you have the NHL playing around and the playoff projections, looking at some of these series that we at least we know we're going to start with, right? We don't know what's going to happen afterwards. We don't know if there's going to be reseeding, but we do know what we're going to get right at the top. So walk us through the process here, or the projections that you're going to have here for the first round of the NHL playoffs as they have been announced.
Okay, so I took my current ratings that when the season cut off and applied them to the matchups here, putting them in a neutral environment, 5-game series, and I projected my own numbers. And then I actually did this article before those odds that came out from Westgate on Tuesday afternoon. So this is a good chance for people to compare what I have to what the actual odds were. And I did that this morning as I was getting ready for the show. And there's a few interesting takes here that maybe some wagers that I might play. I'm going to have to look at them a little closer as we get closer and make my own adjustments on who's playing. Maybe there's some guys out. Obviously, momentum is off the table now, so there's some interesting things. But for instance, I have Pittsburgh as a much bigger favorite than Westgate has. My numbers say they should be about a 260 favorite, and Westgate showing 190. So Pittsburgh, you know, they maybe a little tentative play in the playoffs usually, but that looks like a line that could be underpriced.
Yeah, so if you're looking at it, the Pittsburgh versus Montreal series, as you mentioned, Pittsburgh, according to your numbers in Points Per Weekly, 70.8% overall series win percentage, Montreal 29.2%. And you break these down by exact series as well, correct?
Yeah, because those are some interesting people who maybe take a little longer odds and they project series out. You can get game-by-game odds that'll pay you a little more favorably than an overall series win. So I project the chances of each team winning in the exact number of games. And again, it should help people maybe score some longer odds. And,
you know, it's funny, like, at least when you look at this from your rating, Steve, the parity of hockey somewhat sticks out, and just the weird up and down nature of matchups, right? So the example I'm looking at, like, for example, the 6-11 Carolina versus New York, your overall series win percentage, Carolina just 54.5%. The Rangers obviously on the other side of 45.5%. Then you look at like a 7-10 matchup between the Islanders and the Panthers, and you realize that Florida actually has a 53.6% chance of winning. So it speaks to, again, seeding isn't everything, but it just does speak to what the NHL is at this point in terms of the parity and some of the matchups that we're going to see in the first round.
Yeah, honestly, I'm preparing for next week. So I'm looking at some of the top 20 teams in the last this century from NHL this week. And as you do things like that, you realize how unpredictable the NHL playoffs are. I'm glad you brought that series up with Carolina and the Rangers, because that is an interesting one. They have Carolina. Westgate has Carolina minus 150. Mm-hmm. I have it minus 130. If you look at the head-to-head action between those teams this year, the Rangers won all 4 games. That could be a very favorable series for the Rangers with them being an underdog priced that highly.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up. Where do you stand, and where do some of your numbers project, like, what happens in the regular season versus what happens in the postseason? Because, you know, as an NBA guy, I hear all the time, like, regular season means nothing. I push it back against that completely. Like, matchups absolutely matter. Maybe not straight up, okay, this team won in this many games, this is what's going to happen in the postseason. But if a team is having success in regular season matchups, it is going to translate to some extent in the at least in the postseason, at least to me. What do some of the numbers say to that?
Yeah, I agree with your assessment there. It's in fact, for this series, the scoring was Rangers 17, Carolina 9. So Only one of the 4 games was a 1-goal game. So I don't think you should discount the fact that even the regular season was a while ago. It just might just be a good matchup for the Rangers in that scenario. The Islanders are in a similar situation. They were 3-0 against Florida, and that's a potential that's going to be a proposed first-round matchup too. So. Maybe some favorable matchups for the 2 New York teams. So
you mentioned some of the price discrepancies. Anything in terms of like some big underdogs that you thought were, according to your numbers, a little bit more plucky, had a little bit better shot than some of the numbers that were out there that you saw maybe via the Westgate or somewhere else?
Yeah, well, in addition to I believe the Rangers are a pretty good play there. The other one I was looking at They have Nashville as a -125 favorite. Mine say Arizona -115. So that's a little bit of a flip there. Nashville was playing them maybe a little better later in the season, but again, momentum. How can you even look at any type of momentum in that scenario? Right. And if you are, then maybe you want to turn to Minnesota, Vancouver. Minnesota was pretty good in the last month of the season. They were 15-8, I believe, in their last 23 games. They're a +110 against Vancouver. So it depends on where you view where the teams are going to pick up, I guess. So just some handicapping factors you can consider in looking for value in these series.
And a reminder, too, of course, the top 4 seeds will not participate in this first round. They are essentially godfathered into the second round, and they'll play for their seeding, correct, between the top 4 in each conference?
Well, yeah, it's going to be an interesting scenario. Yeah. I don't think they've decided yet whether it's going to be a seeded 16 or if they're going to reseed the teams that emerge from this first round or not. So it's hard to predict who these teams are going to play when they start up their action. But the other thing that's going to be interesting is they're going to have a longer layoff. Yep. The teams they're going to play against are going to have up to 5 games of hockey under their belts already. So maybe some of the advantage of being a top seed will be eliminated by that.
Last one on hockey before we move on to the other pieces. So we're obviously sitting here. We don't know what the hub cities are going to be. They want to use 2 for each conference. Now, some of the cities, Steve, are actually obviously NHL cities. Some of these teams play in these cities. If that's the case, and I know I read a report that they want to avoid this, but let's say, we get a case where, East and West each get a host city where a team is active. Is there an advantage inherently for like a Vegas to play in Vegas at this point, or is there really nothing going on there considering the circumstances?
Well, I think you're gonna have to kind of look at that. It's not gonna be as big of an advantage as having fans in the stands and having the type of game day atmosphere that carried Vegas to the finals. Yeah. But there'll be some advantage. I mean, familiarity is always an advantage for a team. Knowing how to get to the arena, what the process is to play. It's obviously all that kind of thing is going to be again a case by case basis. But the way I looked at these are neutral series.
Yep. All right, let's move on to a couple of the other things that we have in Point Spread Weekly this week. You mentioned the simulations, and again, walk people through again if they weren't with us last week and what the simulations are, how they can use them for handicapping going forward. We obviously have a race coming up this weekend.
Well, yeah, actually, we got Charlotte tonight yet right after the race was postponed. So that final simulation is in this week's Point Spread Weekly. Alex Bowman, I got on top winning that one. Interestingly, the last time I had him winning a race was at Auto Club California back in February, and he won that race at 8-1 odds. So like the way he's running. He pops up on my article on trends. May's always been a great month for him since he's been on the Cup Series. So he'll be one of the top trend guys tonight, and he's atop my simulation. I use several factors when I look at these simulations: how they do it at that particular track, how they do at similar tracks, how they're doing recently, and then where they're starting. Bowman's starting second tonight, so a lot of things going for him. He should be a pretty popular wager, and much of the reason why he's atop my simulation.
All right, and then, of course, you have that tonight, and then that's the 27th, and then is it the Food City 500 coming up on the 31st?
Yeah, Bristol, always a kind of a crapshoot there. Right. Tight racing, one of the smaller tracks. So I will have a final simulation of that when the starting spots are determined. And that isn't one that I would say go bet that one heavily. Right. In fact, compared to Charlotte and Bristol are both tracks where maybe tread a little more lightly than some others. So Charlotte has a handicap ability grade of C- on my scale, and Bristol's a C+. So not two of the better stats for using statistical analysis. But if you got a good feeling about a driver, hey, let's go with it.
I had a good feeling of, what was it, the first race back, and Jimmy Johnson actually took the lead at one point. I had him at 22-1, and then, of course, the crash. That was heartbreaking. I don't know if I can get back into NASCAR, Steve, after what happened.
Hey, let's go with Alex Bowman. I would have actually warned you a little bit about Johnson. He doesn't seem like he's that close to winning. You know? I mean, he runs up front, but he seems to be snake bit by mistakes lately, and that's almost feels like he's pressing a little bit. That team's pressing, still trying to kind of know each other a little bit better. So until Johnson starts showing signs where he's finishing top 3 consistently, I wouldn't expect him to win.
Well, let's talk. We're not done with racing. Let's talk a little bit about your other article here. Driver trends can aid NASCAR better. So people love trends. They love trends in the National Football League. They love trends in general when they're betting on sports. So walk us through this process here. Are NASCAR trends? Actually, I'll start with this. Are NASCAR trends not like inherently popular when it comes to NASCAR betting? Is this something kind of new, foreign territory when it comes to finding trends with guys, whether where they start, anything like that?
As far as I know, the way I did this, I've never seen it before. So this is it. I would like to hear any NASCAR bettors' comments on the way I've done this. So what I've done is taken certain scenarios and situations and compared active drivers' average finishes in that scenario and compared it to what they do the rest of the races. So if they have let's go to one of the trends specifically, because this is a good one, because Matt DiBenedetto is starting 4th tonight. He is typically a driver that does well when he starts in a higher position. So Matt DiBenedetto's average finish when starting in the top 5 is position number 14 since 2017. In the rest of his races, it's 23.5. So it's an advantage of 9.5. I give that on this trend scale. So it's one of the bigger and better trends available for this evening, and makes me maybe consider Matt DiBenedetto in a couple different wagering options.
So to give people some ideas of some of the trends that you'll see when you sign up for Point Spread Weekly, top 5 trend drivers in May races by average finish, bottom 5 trend drivers in May races by average finish. Then you have, as Steve alluded to, the qualifying starting position, top 5 trend drivers when starting in the front row. Look at my boy, Jimmy Johnson. But then you have, and there's a lot of drivers here, like there's a lot of content. So you mentioned the one that stuck out to you. Anything else with some of these trends that really stuck out when you were going through, whether it's top 5 trend drivers starting 11 to 20, anything else?
Yeah, this is an interesting one from Sundays. Clint Boyer had he hit the wall pretty hard on Sunday and knocked away bad finish. So one of the trends I looked at is drivers when they're coming off of a finish of 30th or worse, a bad finish. How do they respond? Clint Boyer's average finish when coming off a 30th or worse finish is 11.4.
Wow.
In all his other races since 2017, it's 15.6. So he's got an advantage of 4.2 positions on here. I would expect him to bounce back pretty well tonight. He's a veteran driver. If you're looking at him in typical normal odds scenario, he might be a little bit underpriced when compared to other races.
Yep. So again, there's a lot of different trends and formats that you can look at here again in this week's edition of Point Spread Weekly. So check it out, VSiN.com/subscribe. All right, let's move on. This is one of my favorite articles this week, Steve. Power rating Major League Baseball's top 20 since 2000, mainly because the 2002 Angels checked in, I believe, at number 7. I'm an Angels guy, so I was totally down with this. So you had, correct me if I'm wrong, last week was it NFL teams top 20?
Last week was college.
College
football. Yeah.
So this week,
this week's baseball. For the 3rd straight week, the team that's on top did not even win a title. So it's very interesting the way this is shaking out. And I'm going to give you another hint here is week number 4, as I do this NHL, it's going to be another team that didn't win a title. But number 1, everybody, it shouldn't come as a surprise. The Mariners, 2001, 116-46, tremendous season that year. Brett, when I look back at the stats for this team, I was just astounded. I just basically blocked out the fact that Brett Boone had such a massive breakout season that year. 37 homers, 141 RBIs, just so atypical for him.
All right.
And actually, one of the reasons they had such a big year, they're number 1. The first team that won a World Series that shows up is at number 2, 2018 Red Sox.
Number 1, yep, the 2001 Seattle Mariners. Number 2, 2018 Red Sox. Your third, again, these are your power-rated MLB teams, top 20 since 2000. The 2004 St. Louis Cardinals. When you looked over this at all, I mean, because you mentioned it, right, the top team not winning a championship. I feel like just in general narrative, there's a lot of great teams that didn't win championships. What was the balance in terms of the top 20 with teams that had won them and teams that didn't?
9 World Series winners.
Yeah.
Fairly typical. 12 different franchises represented, and Boston has the most teams on the list with 4. The interesting thing about the Red Sox is all 4 of their teams that made this list won the World Series. Goes to show that when they're a good team, they're a franchise that does well in the playoffs as well.
I think we had this current run by the Dodgers. 2 of their teams on this list as well?
Yeah, very unfortunate they're not winning anything for them. But obviously, we know some of the story behind that.
Right. Poor management decisions. I think a lot of them really held them back for a while. So again, top 20 Major League Baseball teams in terms of their power rating since 2000. Again, a cool, fun list. And what's coming up next? What are you going to come out with next in terms of power ratings? NHL is next?
Yeah, NHL's next. I already put the list together. I gotta dig back into the teams, do the season recaps. But just a hint about this. Ottawa, you just forget how dominant that team was in the early part of the 2000s. Mm-hmm. They're very dominant. Just because they didn't win a title, nobody really remembers them.
That's right. It's all about the rings, right, Steve? If anybody really counts rings, that's all that matters. Steve Makinen, editor for Point Spread Weekly. Steve, it's always great to catch up with you again. A fantastic episode and edition of Point Spread Weekly. Make sure you check it out, VSiN.com/subscribe. We will catch up next week, my friend.
Sounds good, Jonathan. Thanks for having me again.
Yep, you got it. Again, Point Spread Weekly. And by the way, Steve's power ratings for the National Football League still in there as well. So, and they were in last week, but you can check that out, VSiN.com/subscribe. And again, these are tools that you can use for your handicapping and building this forward and moving forward. So you don't have to even take everything in this magazine verbatim, but what you can do is you can take it, you can use it as part of your process, and then spin it forward, because it's all about, as Brent says, right, making you a better handicapper. All right, Matt Youmans is going to join us bottom of the hour. We're not done with the National Football League. We'll take a look at the point values of quarterbacks in the NFL. Ron Flatter's with us as we continue our run for the roses. We'll take a look at which horses are hot and which horses are not. Welcome back into Point Spread Weekly. I'm your host, Jonathan Von Tobel. Make sure you check out your VSiN Plus subs are free until a major sport returns, VSiN.com/subscribe. Let's head out, check in with Ron Flatter in the midst of a beautiful day here out in Sin City. Flatter, appreciate the time as always, my friend. You know I like checking in with the Derby run for the roses, as we have called it here on Point Spread Weekly. So right. Let's start with this. You know, you have your piece in this week's Maxfield charges into the Derby picture. Give us the story here behind Maxfield, his win over the weekend, and what it's done for his odds.
Yeah, Maxfield had an ankle chip that kept him out of the Breeders' Cup Juvenile last year, JVT, and he would have been one of the favorites for the race, but he didn't race, and so he had he's been off since last fall, comes back for the Matt Winn Stakes and wins it very handily, and so William Hill, his odds were cut from 11-1 to 10-1. Circus Sports was just opened its Kentucky Derby futures, certainly with less exposure, less liability, was able to go 22-1 with him to start out, cut him to plus 950. So a lot of bettors are looking at him, and you have to certainly look at him being on merit, one of the top 5 horses right now for the Derby. Might not be value there, and I've said this before. As you look at futures, some people will look at futures and say, you know something, 10-1 now, if you're getting him at 5-1 on race day is fine. I say no, because a lot of things can happen between now and then. We saw what happened with race week favorite Omaha Beach last year, didn't even get to the race. I look at them at 100-1 now until a couple months out. But I know some people would like to look at Maxfield at 10-1, get every bit of that, because you're looking at 5 or 6-1 overseas.
Right, and we might see a shift, which we'll get to in a moment, with the top of the future odds, right, with some of the horses and some news came out there. But I wanted to ask you, so I was reading your piece, to read an excerpt really quickly. With a Beyer speed figure of 95 and only his third start, Maxfield is right where a serious contender should be. So for me, like a novice horse better Ron, I would assume, just reading that 95 is a very solid figure. Tie that in. Like, what exactly is a Beyer speed figure? How do you want to use that in terms of the handicapping, and where is that in comparison with some good horses? Because obviously you're making it sound like it is a very solid figure to have at this point leading up to the Kentucky Derby.
Unlike track and field, JVT, different race surfaces from different tracks yield different times. Right. You can't simply take, say, a minute and a half at one track and say it equates to a minute and a half at another. The Beyer speed figure tries to equate all those things, taking into account weather, track surface. Track bias is how they play that day. 95 or more tends to get you into the discussion to win the Kentucky Derby. Most of the last 30 years of Kentucky Derby winners came into the race with a Beyer speed figure of at least 95.
All right, I like it. Ron Flatter with us, the Big F, as we call him here at VSiN. All right, so let's talk about this news. We alluded to it just now. Questions about medication and Bob Baffert's horses. I feel like he's got some pretty good horses near the top of the futures board. So what was the news, and what could the effects be on the futures board here?
Again, compared to track and field. Preliminary test on a drug sample came up positive. You need to run a secondary test to make sure that's true. A lot of times they come back and find that the first test was an abnormality and they throw it out because the second test didn't confirm it. We're in between the first and second tests now. Normally, these things are supposed to be confidential, but somebody leaked the news out at Oaklawn Park on Arkansas Derby testing. That's where this all came from. And we have since learned that it is Charlatan, the horse that tested positive, or at least that's what the reporting says. Also, Gamine, one of Baffert's fillies and a Kentucky Oaks possibility, has reportedly tested positive. They're going to go through, check the second sample, see what happens there. But bettors might look at this and say, Charlatan may not go or may not be eligible to go to the Kentucky Derby. Already Baffert telling the Blood Horse magazine that Charlatan now probably will look at a sprint on Belmont Stakes Day and not the Belmont Stakes itself. Nadal definitely going. He's in the clear on all of this. So bettors might look at this going forward now, not just on Kentucky Derby futures, but as we're going to start to see Belmont Stakes futures. Circa will open its next week. We'll start to see maybe a little bit of fading on Charlatan as we go forward.
All right, last minute and a half here, Ron. Who is hot in our run for the Roses?
Okay, well, the who's hot, we're going to go to Cezanne. Speaking of Baffert horses, 25-1 now posted at Circa, not posted at William Hill, has yet to race, but 3 of his last 4 workouts have been what we call bullet workouts. Best workout on the track that day among those on the course. Pneumatic, a Steve Asmussen horse, might now be his best of a loaded barn, but nobody really standing out until that third-place finish in the Matt Win, where he competed all the way to the wire. And Art Collector for Tom Drury at 150-1 wound up coming up with a win in a sprint allowance at Churchill Downs. The question, though, can he go 2 turns? And as far as the horses that are not hot, Nye Traffic, New York Traffic was second in the Matt Win. He seems to have second-itis, just can't win a race. Attachment Rate for Dale Romans, he seems to be regressing, finishing 4th in the Matt Win. And Major Fed was last in the Matt Win. He's had excuses in all those losses, but eventually you run out of excuses, JVT.
That's right, Ron Flyer. I like that. A case of second-itis. That is an absolutely fantastic term. I will steal it and give you no credit. Ron, it's always good to talk to you, man. Thanks a lot.
I stole it too, JVT, and I don't know who to credit.
It's a tradition. I would actually feel comfortable then stealing it and moving on from there. Ron Flatter, again, find the work in Point Spread Weekly, as we have called it, our run for the Roses here at PSW. All right, we have plenty to get to. Lou Finocchiaro joins us on the other side. We're going to talk about UFC Fight Night and a look at UFC 250. Much more to get to last 30 here on Point Spread Weekly. Quick Picks, the real money parlay props game based on daily fantasy scoring, has your favorite NASCAR drivers and head-to-head matchups in this week's races. And VSiN customers can play Quick Picks through this special offer. Get a 100% automatic deposit bonus up to $100 when you sign up for a new Quick Picks account. All you got to do is go to quickpicks.com/VSiN bonus, then select the ones you think will finish with higher fantasy point totals. Pick between 3 and 10, then place your bet. Bet 10 cents, bet $100. If all your picks are right, you win. The UFC, PGA, and MLB are coming soon. Available in 27 states and D.C. You got to be 21 or older. Go to quickpicks.com/VSiN bonus and start playing Quick Picks now. It is Point Spread Weekly here on VSiN, the sports betting network. Let's head back out. Welcome in Lou Finocchiaro. Lou, nice enough to give us some time to discuss the fight card this weekend. Lou, thank you very much. Let's start with this, though. The Florida circuit was great for Gamblu, was it not?
It was a successful run, and I was so happy to be back to work. I just wish that for all my other fellow handicappers on the ASAP.
That's right. The Florida card, at least UFC 249 and Overeem in a very good comeback, were very, very solid for myself. So I enjoyed UFC up to this point. We have a big card coming up 250, but that's not for another week. So let's discuss the main event really quickly as we have Woodley and Burns going at it. Woodley right now in the range of about $1.80 favorite. And you note in your piece actually opened up at -150. So walk us through the matchup here. The welterweight, of course, matchup that we're going to see this weekend. And what's the handicap? Who has the advantages?
I look at Burns as having tremendous momentum, and momentum breeds belief, and that's right where Burns is. He's won 5 straight, his last 3 in the welterweight division, which is 170. Because he dabbled in 155, I tend to think of him as more a large 55er. And he tends to be, I think, a little bit of a tweener and undersized at 170. His 3 fights at 170 was a win against another basic blown-up lightweight in a Russian named Kunchenko. And then his last 2 fights against Gunnar Nelson and Damian Maia, both aged, one-dimensional jiu-jitsu grappling type of fighters without much strike game. Burns is a Brazilian jiu-jitsu specialist himself. He's young, he's explosive, and his striking has been on the improve. I believe, however, that his body of work at 170 leaves him a little lacking. On the other side, Jonathan, you have Tyron Woodley, who hasn't fought in basically a year, just a little over a year. He lost his title, looked sluggish and lethargic in doing so. He's had a rap career. And as I view from the outside looking in this fight, Burns's stock could really never be higher, and Woodley's really can't be lower. But if you strip that away and take a look at Woodley having a 3-inch reach advantage with legs and arms, he's going to be the older man. He's 38 to Burns 32, 33. So while Burns will have the youth and the momentum advantage, I think the body of work that Woodley's undertaken, his experience, and the fact that I know he's training well and he has a chip and he's focused, makes this a fight where I think Burns is chewing off a little bit more than he should be at this point. But it makes for a reasonable line on Woodley, who I handicap closer to 240 or 250, to be honest with you. So current pricing, I believe, is fine.
All right. I like it. Tyron Woodley again, and actually in some global shops reaching a little bit over $2, but for the most part stateside in the range now of $1.75 to $1.85, depending on where you look. Anything else on the card this weekend that stuck out to you? Obviously, this is the main event, relatively deep card for UFC on ESPN. I think it's card number 9 for ESPN. Anything else in terms of any other bouts that stuck out to you, Lou?
There is, because the fact that we're going to be employing a 25-foot octagon in Las Vegas as opposed to the normal 30-foot octagon that most of the large venues and all 3 Florida events featured. That's a 44% smaller octagon, 20 feet less width. So when you look at the bigger boys on this card, is it going to make a big difference for the 125-pound women? Not as much. But for Ivanov and Sakai heavyweights, and then you put a third man in the octagon, those guys are going to feel really, really cozy. And that small cage encourages, in fact, the stats are 20% more strikes in the smaller cage. I believe that the smaller cage is going to favor a guy like Ivanov, who's a grappler and wants everything up close and personal. The longer, younger Sakai that wants to use movement and reach is going to be at a disadvantage, actually, because he's not going to have the room to execute that. The other fight, Abreu fights down on the card with Jamal Hill. That's another fight in exactly the same vein. They're not heavyweights, but they're light heavyweights. And Jamal Hill in a 30-foot octagon, I'd look at 143 as a very attractive price on him. But in the shorter octagon, I believe that Abreu, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu specialist, will be able to clasp him, get a hold of him, and if it goes to the ground, which Jamal Hill was taken down by a relative newcomer in Damon Stoicic in one of his earlier UFC fights, 6-7 times. Kidson Abreu gets Hill down, it's going to be the end of Hill, and I think he's going to get him down. And these come specifically to me in looking at the matchup that the smaller octagon delivers.
I get Lou Finocchairo. Again, find the work, Insight the Octagon here in Point Spread Weekly. Lou, we got about 90 seconds left. We don't need the detailed analysis, but are there 2-3 fights that you have circled that you'll start your handicapping on for UFC 250?
Yeah, I've made the move on Woodley. That's a bet. I'm going to suggest anyone take Ivanov. He's going to make weight. He's a heavyweight. I'm leaning heavily to Brock Weaver. I'm leaning very heavily, as I mentioned, to Abreu. I'm just waiting for weigh-ins tomorrow on those, Jonathan. If a guy's dying for a live dog, Royval fighting Elliott down below, he might be a good way to start off your underdog betting earlier in the card. And Casey Kenny against Louis Smoke is a mismatch. Kenny, you got to pay almost 4-1 with, but if you take him to win by decision, which he's a decision fighter, that gets real close to -110 for you.
Lou, always good to talk to you, sir. Thank you very much. Great job.
Thanks, Jonathan.
You got it. Again, all the analysis you need on UFC on ESPN this weekend, Woodley and Birds. That'll be up in Point Spread Weekly, and check out Lou Gamblou on Twitter. All right, when we return back to the National Football League, Matt Youmans is going to join us. We're going to talk about point spread values for quarterbacks going to their backups. Chris Andrews gives us the information every single year, and it's something you don't want to miss out on. Wrapping it up here on Point Spread Weekly. Make sure you check out VSiN.com/subscribe. Remember, PSW free until a major sport returns. Check it out, VSiN.com/subscribe. By the way, it's not just Point Spread Weekly. You get the video stream, you get the live replays, all that kind of stuff for free. VSiN.com/subscribe. Matt Youmans is with us, senior editor. He doesn't like the senior part of Point Spread Weekly and VSiN. Big Ben still among most valuable quarterbacks. Chris Andrews does this for us every single year. Youmans gives us his thoughts in terms of the point spread value from one quarterback to another. And that's where I wanted to start, because I think we talk about this every year, right? People think a quarterback is worth X to a point spread. It's not necessarily the case, right? It's what's the difference between him and the dude that's behind him.
Exactly. I mean, when you're talking about the value of a quarterback to the point spread, it's an exercise that really emphasizes evaluation of the backup quarterback. And when you look at the top of Chris Andrews' list, you got two old school quarterbacks, Tom Brady and Ben Roethlisberger. And not necessarily because those guys are, the elite of the class at this point. It's partly because their backups are so lame. Brady's backed up by Blaine Gabbert, and Big Ben backed up by Mason Rudolph. So you're talking about a 7-point adjustment if you go from the starter to the backup. And again, as Chris Andrews, the South Point Sportsbook director, as he said, this is a one-game adjustment. And, these numbers can change if that quarterback has to take over for an extended amount of time, if he has to play several games, whatever. But for one game, it would be from Brady to Gabbert, 7, from Big Ben to Mason Rudolph, 7, from Russell Wilson to Geno Smith, it would also be 7 points. So those three quarterbacks are tied at the top of the list. And, of course, JVT, that's assuming that Ben Roethlisberger is healthy. If you read all the reports, he said he's got no pain in the elbow. He had surgery. Obviously played only 2 games last year. He says he's throwing without pain. He feels younger. I'm not sure if he's lost weight, if he's in better shape. But regardless, we saw how bad the Steelers could be offensively last year with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges at quarterback.
It's the reason why they didn't make the postseason. They were 8-5 and finished 8-8 because they couldn't get a semblance of quarterback play from it. And I don't think, too, like when we talk about this, Youmans, like, again, like the difference between the quarterback and the backup, it's really exemplified by the next few guys on the list. Like if you were to tell somebody, as bad as Jared Goff played last year, that he was worth 6 points to the line, they'd be like, you're insane. but his backup is John Wolford, right? And so like that's the example we're talking about. Jared Goff really isn't that good, and by himself he's worth not that much, but because his backup is who he is worth that much to a one-game point spread.
Yeah, when you're talking about the Rams in that specific
Right.
case, John Wolford, if I'm right, JVT, I think the last time we really saw him play, aside from the NFL preseason, was in the Alliance of American Football, right? Didn't he play for Arizona?
I believe he
did.
did.
He wasn't very good. He wasn't very good in the AAF. So you're talking about a 6-point adjustment from Goff to Wolford. And, Chris Andrews said, hey, I'm not crazy about Jared Goff, and I'm not either. For some reason, Rams gave the guy $110 million contract. It's $110 million guaranteed in that contract. But it is a steep drop from Goff to John Wolford because Rams really don't have a good backup plan. I think one of the more intriguing ones on the list is right there in that same point range is Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love, because how do you evaluate a rookie like Jordan Love? You really can't until you see him play in the preseason a little bit. But I think you just automatically have to say it's a 6 or 7 point adjustment. And Chris Andrews made the Packers a 6-point adjustment.
Yeah. Were there any that surprised you when you saw some of the differences? What were some that stuck out to you?
There were a couple. One I think that really surprised me was I thought he'd make the Chiefs a little bit higher.
Yeah.
Patrick Mahomes, Chad Henne, a 5-point drop off. I thought that would be 6.5 or 7. But Chris explained it well. He said, hey, this is just for one game. And the Chiefs have so many weapons, and Andy Reid's so good at preparing backup quarterbacks. We saw it last year with Matt Moore. They can still operate offensively and be pretty good for one game with a backup quarterback. Now, if Patrick Mahomes is out for an extended amount of time, that's going to be probably more than 5 points on the adjustment. But that was for one game. I think the one that a lot of people are going to be surprised by is Dak Prescott to Andy Dalton.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't surprise me as much. I thought Chris would make it 3. Chris made the drop off from Dak to Dalton 2 points. And it really, I think, to put it in perspective, you look at the contract talks right now between Dak Prescott and the Cowboys, and we're talking about $35 million a year or more. And Andy Dalton's making about, $5 million.
Yep.
So you got a $30 million difference there and a 2-point difference to the point spread. As Chris said, he thinks Dak is a highly overrated quarterback. Andy Dalton's underrated. He's better than he showed because he got poor coaching. He was, let's face it, a poor organization in Cincinnati. And maybe the drop off from Dak to Dalton is not that much. I thought it would be 3. Chris made it 2. I think that's interesting, especially when you put it in perspective of how much money Dak Prescott seems to be about to get on the market.
Yep. So there were 3 that really stuck out to me. The first one, and I think it'll surprise a lot of people, the Lamar Jackson, Robert Griffin III difference of only 3.5. I thought that'd be more closer to 5, only because, we only saw it in a one-off at the end of the year. But Robert Griffin III didn't look insanely impressive in the last game of the regular season last year when he filled in for Jackson when they sat everybody. And the dynamic aspect of his game in terms of his mobility and his, and his pocket presence and his throwing, I thought Lamar, I think the gap between him and RG3 would be a little bit bigger than 3.5 points.
Yeah, that's another one I was going to mention as well. And, I told Chris, I said, I can see where you're coming from there. But, my number on that would have been around 4.5. I would have had Lamar Jackson to RG3 about a 4.5 point difference. Yep.
That one, the second for me was Ryan Fitzpatrick and Tua Tagovailoa. One, you mentioned like the rookie thing, right? We can't really evaluate these guys. The other is the backup at Tua Tagovailoa. We've talked with, right? It was the conversation leading up to the draft, the injuries, the hip, like how healthy is this kid? And to say it's only a 2-point difference in a guy like Ryan Fitzpatrick, who's a really steady veteran, I thought was pretty surprising as well.
Yeah, and Chris Andrews said from Fitzmagic to Tua, it's a 2-point difference. Yep. And from Fitz to Josh Rosen, it's a 3-point difference. And we don't know if Josh Rosen's still going to be with the Dolphins when training camp opens. You got to think some teams are looking at him as a viable backup quarterback. I think Fitz is worth a little bit more than that than Tua at this point. People tend to forget Week 17, the Patriots were 17-point home favorites.
Right.
And Fitzmagic put up 27 points on the Patriots defense and upset New England in a huge Week 17 game that changed the playoff picture for the Patriots. Fitz did that against a very good New England defense. I don't think Tua is prepared to do that against a really good NFL defense. I probably would have made the Fitz to 2 a drop off 3 or 3.5 points at this stage.
Yep, I would completely agree with that. And this next one, it's not so much the skill of the starter, it's how bad the backup is, at least in my mind. Only a 1-point difference between Sam Darnold and Joe Flacco. Like when we saw like the bottom of the barrel Joe Flacco with Denver, and coming off of a neck injury too, like that really surprised me. And I would assume that Chris really just isn't that high on Sam Darnold then, just reading into that number.
Yeah, what Chris said is, he's not a big Sam Darnold fan because he turns the ball over so often. And, that's the biggest problem with Sam going back to USC is he was just a turnover machine. Chris did emphasize a healthy Joe Flacco. So it's a 1-point difference from Darnold to Flacco if Flacco's healthy. And I saw where he said this week he's not going to be healthy for week 1. He's not going to be ready to go. And Chris said that the difference from Darnold to David Fales, the number 3 quarterback, would be a 4-point difference. But, yeah, I could see where that would surprise a couple of people because we just haven't seen much from Joe Flacco at all the past couple of years. Another one maybe I'll mention quickly is Tyrod Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be the Chargers starting quarterback. Justin Herbert, the first-round pick from Oregon, and Chris made the difference 1 point. I think you really got to give Tyrod Taylor a little bit more credit at this point. He's a guy who doesn't turn the ball over. He did take the Bills to the playoffs. A couple of years ago, I think Tyrod Taylor at this stage, and again, we're talking about a drop off to a rookie who hasn't taken a snap yet in the NFL. I think Tyrod would be about a 3-point difference to Justin Herbert if you're talking about week 1. But again, Chris Andrews put a lot of time into these numbers, and he did a great job on the entire list of 32 quarterbacks. And I think this is always interesting for people to see what the difference is from the starter to the backup to the point spread.
Right, and we should also know, too, of course, again, these are Chris Andrews. Odds makers' opinions are going to differ. They're going to be different, right, from backup to backup and from quarterback position to quarterback position, right?
No question about it. And, you can also, like you said, that's what the difference of opinion is what makes betting. And that's what Chris mentioned that. There are going to be people with different opinions, and he understands that. But again, all these numbers are fluid because, again, it's for a 1-game situation. Things change. And but this is a starting point to go by, at the end of May when we're talking about the NFL season in early September. So another thing I was going to mention, JVT, you've had a lot of guests on talking about Point Spread Weekly. I'm actually pretty proud of the fact that 2.5 months into this pandemic that we really have not put out one lame issue of Point Spread Weekly.
Right.
We've done a pretty good job, I think, for I'd say 10 consecutive weeks of putting out a really good issue of Point Spread Weekly with not a lot going on in the sports world.
Yep, I've been really impressed reading every single week and doing these shows as well. It's been absolutely great in terms of the content we've turned out at Point Spread Weekly. So again, you can check this out and much others, but the article we're discussing as Youmans sits down with Andrews every single year in the offseason, the point differentials between starting quarterbacks and backup quarterbacks in the National Football League. And Youmans, I'll get you out of here on this comment. You made the money comparison in Dallas. How about this? $19 million difference between Phillip Rivers and Jacoby Brissett, but a 2-point difference on the board. Interesting.
And Chris Andrews said, and I agree, he's not even sure if Phillip Rivers is any better than Jacoby Brissett. And like I said, I agree with that, and I think you do as well.
Yep. All right, Youmans, it's good to talk to you, man. We'll catch up soon, okay?
All right, you bet. Thanks.
Matt Youmans, senior editor of VSiN, Point Spread Weekly as well. Follow him on Twitter at Matt Youmans 24/7. Yeah, and again, as you have said here and you've watched, we haven't gotten to every single quarterback in terms of the differentials. Youmans not only gives analysis on every single quarterback situation, but you have the entire list of which you could pick apart. Again, Chris Andrews' opinions on the point differential between starter and backup in the National Football League at the quarterback position. VSiN.com/subscribe is a spot where you want to go. Point Spread Weekly free until a major sport returns, and check out everything else a VSiN Plus sub has to offer. We'll see you.